Okay, here's a new article that just came out on Egypt News, and it's about Nabta Playa. Nabta Playa is a Stonehenge type, but more primitive looking type setup that they have that's in southern Egypt, not down towards the Mediterranean Delta, although the people that they found there were Mediterranean people that they've already talked about. And I made a video about it about 3.5 years ago. And then also about, I don't know, 2 years ago or a little more, I made another one about it where totally different view. Somebody had said that this is where Satan was buried up under the great pit that was from long ago and da 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 and all these things. And certain things that they found in writings led to an idea that this was it. And they try to make connections to fallen angels having come down and given this ideal and all this stuff that goes on, and I tried to make sense of it, but also I was pretty much just reading the other person's article on it and commenting, of course. But let's look into this more. They say Nabta Playa is the world's first astronomical site. It was built in Africa and is older than Stonehenge. It's kind of questionable. They've never really found the true date of Stonehenge. They have found whenever they did the secondary deal and everything else. But they also really realized that it had been made like a wood hinge type of deal. And I recently made a wood hinge video that shows a much older wood hinge was already around and already lined up extremely like this. Not working with stone, but working with another wood that Tectons wood. Because if you build your house out of straw, as people did in ancient days, nothing lasts and you never knew it existed hardly. But they found some remnants of huts out here and stuff. But then, if you build your house out of wood, you still, pretty much like the story goes, won't really ever find anything from that, will you? Nah, probably not. Yeah, you're lucky if you realize that there's a place that something was going on, and because there was something going on, you put those sensors and check it out, and you can find all these post holes. In fact, that's kind of how they found that wood hinge site and a few others that they found. And it's amazing with LiDAR and things like that what we're starting to find. And this was kind of an odd finding too. And I think in this article or the other one we'll go into after this, it describes it. But if it may not be the world's first astronomical site, because now, and of course this person is probably well aware, we have Göbekli Tepe, and it is not only an astronomical site, but it has the zodiac signs done correctly, and some of those pillars line up exactly to what the sky would have looked like at the time that the radiocarbon date goes on to. So, I mean, yeah, Scorpio and things, and you would, yeah, that's what you'd be seeing coming up, and that's what it would look like. So, that has to be astronomy. But also in a recent video, I've shown you how that they had it all lined up with the solstices and everything too. But then also in another video I've shown where someone's picked it apart and figured out that those three major rings that are down there, I haven't checked out all the other ones yet, but those three are sacred geometry. Yeah, and it works off a Pythagorean theorem situation. And that just, and everybody's, all up in arms, or, most people are trying to scoff at it. And I've heard one guy, which all apologists try to do, is they say, well, it was just a happy accident that all the circles line up and this thing does like that. And I'd like to say there really are very few happy accidents that I've ever found that anybody's ever shown. But this 7,000-year-old stone circle tracked the summer solstice and the arrival of the annual monsoon seasons that used to happen in this area, by the way. It's also the oldest known astronomical site on Earth. Now, there's still weather that happens here and it switches, but as I've also talked about in a few of my recent videos over the last year and a half or two, that whenever Egypt has their flood, it's not along with the exact spring. that we would think of that goes along with the northern hemisphere and where that happens. And then most people know that and realize that when it's summer up here, it's winter in the southern hemisphere, and it toggles back and forth. Because the Nile is attached to the equator, it kind of pivots off what happens off that and the coming back of the sun, and therefore in summer solstice it sets it off. But there used to be monsoons that got pulled and sucked across the Great Sahara Desert before it became the Great Sahara Desert, and it used to be green. And I've done a few videos about the Green Sahara, Mermaids of the Green Sahara, which I like that video, and a few other things, but about the same people, cave art, the Natufian people that go along with this group of people, and also the Mectoid type people, Caucasians, that are all across North Africa, all the way in primordial times, all the way coming back. In fact, they've redated that situation. The oldest person they find, Caucasoid type, is over 200,000 years ago, and it was found in Ethiopia, but now we found 315,000 years ago in Jebel Arud cave system over near the Pillars of Hercules, or Straits of Gibraltar, if you will, and 315,000 years ago. And a lot of times when they're reporting it now, they just say 300,000 BC, and that's a far cry from what I was led to believe whenever I was a kid. I was led to believe that Homo sapiens comes after kind of Cro-Magnon and the Neanderthal thing, and before that they were Ugg, but also 4000 BC we were Ugg, and we're finding stuff that's well over twice that date that shows you no, they weren't Ugg. They had a lot going on. In fact, they got around quite a bit more than anybody wants to believe. For there's Adam's calendar that's kind of like this all the way down in the Cape. But that's another video. Let's get into this or I'll never get started. This just came out June 20th, and we are at the summer solstice. And no, I'm not going to just get into it yet. I want to show you this picture here. So here it is, and it's not Stonehenge. And I hate whenever they try to say the Stonehenge of Da, because generally it's nothing as grand as Stonehenge in any way, but it is a circle wheel calendar and everything, and I get what they mean, but that's just like every time they find any building whatsoever, it's always a temple. If you'll look, this picture was taken on that summer solstice that we're talking about, so today, but probably not this year. And you can tell so because see the shadows of all these pillars and how it runs down this track that's right here that leads out. So there's two, which is a gate, and it comes through this corral into another gate. And everything's lined up, and they're flat surfaced to that. Now, they're not greatly worked stones, but they're flat surfaced to that. Now, there's also a cutting through here, and we'll talk about this in a minute. It comes up through here, right? But if you look at the shadows, they're coming down through here. And so this morning that this picture was taken, you would have seen the sun lined up through these things. Well, there's some more stones that are out of place a little bit. They used larger ones that go onto here. This one almost looks like a T-pillar. It's set up in a circle, and they've noted it's not quite a circle. So it's a good attempt, but this side right here, this side right here is squished in just a little bit. The rest of it's a perfect circle, though, so that they've always wondered if it got manipulated back in the day. And whenever they found this, supposedly some of them were kind of leaned over and so on. Some of these things are 9 foot tall, but you can stand up next to them, so there's a good amount of them stuck in the ground. And had the sandstorms worked out correctly, you'd probably never see this thing. Whenever you find it on Google Earth, it's just some little doddles in a circle. But there's other stuff near there too that I think that they need to investigate. But it's way the hell out here. So let's get into this. This is a stone circle of Nabta Playa, marking the summer solstice as we saw it there. A time coincided with the arrival of the monsoon rains in the Sahara deserts thousands of years ago. And it still has the remnant of that and the weather that causes the melt that's going to be up in Ethiopian and the Horn area where the Nile begins, Dr. Livingston, I presume, and then melts and comes down. Now, of course, it's been dammed and things like that, and they let it loose at certain times so it doesn't do an incredible flooding. In fact, there's so much evaporation in that area that dam is down a little bit, and so it has the ability to take on a bunch if they ever have a hard winter that can pull into it in a hard spring. But things like that don't really happen here anymore. Rainfalls are counted in the negative situation almost here. For thousands of years, ancient societies all around the world erected massive stone circles, aligning them with the sun and stars to mark the seasons. These people were called Caucasians or Aryans. These early calendars foretold the coming of spring, summer, fall, and winter, helping civilizations track when to plant and harvest crops. And they shared it with those people, and that's why they got their crap going on, and that spread civilization around having to do with farming, taking people out of exclusive hunter-gathering. They also served as ceremonial sites, both for celebration and sacrifice, and were kind of key points, at least in special times, so they'd let you know, hey, so many days we got to meet at X. Well, how do they know it's so many days? Because, well, the sun comes up a few days before this, and it's not quite in line, but as it comes up, it tips into the edge of it, and the people that are watching this stuff, and the shamans and stuff like that, are paying attention. And they've been paying attention for a long time. This is not something they made up yesterday for this. This is just a piece of it passing around the world. These megaliths, large prehistoric monuments made of stone, may seem mysterious in our modern era. Many people lack a connection with or even view of the stars. Some even hold them up as supernatural or divine by aliens. But many ancient societies kept time by tracking which constellations rose at sunset, like reading a giant celestial clock, and others pinpointed the star's location in the sky on the summer and winter solstice, the longest and shortest days of the year, or the spring and the fall equinox. And this is the designation that you see that looks like a cross with a circle around it. And we see that in the zodiac, and you see that on the top of staves that are held by holy people. Yeah, there's a shepherdy thing that's going on, and then all of a sudden you see this other thing, and they've realized that that other thing is actually can be used quite well as a sextant. There's a guy who's recreated one of those things, and you hang this weight from it and you tilt it around, and you could really pretty much build the pyramids with 2 sticks, a piece of rope a few 100 feet long, and one of those. But they didn't use something like that. They used something that looked like a triangle with a plumb bob hanging down. Regardless, though, it's something like that you can use. And by the way, you can use it floating on a ship, looking at stars. Now, a ship goes bobbing up and down, and so guesstimations have to be made and things, but also just knowing how far things are above the horizon versus what they always are, and so on, gives you an idea of where you're going, and perhaps that you've gone too far this way, need to go back. And this is only mainly on large journeys, but you can imagine somebody cutting across the Mediterranean during the evening, and what they do is they wait for the stars to come up and start whipping across, and whenever they do, they pick that, second star to the right, on till morning, like in Peter Pan. A ding. These megaliths, large prehistoric monuments made of stone, may seem mysterious in our modern era, and many people lack a connection with this viewing of the stars, though. And people don't get to see it in the city, and you really can only see the brightest of stars. But if you get out in the country, man, wow. That's one thing I remember distinctly of being a kid, how we would, once we were able to drive, that we would drive out to Club Lake and places like that, way out. And you can all of a sudden see the stars. Also, if you look back, you can see the glow coming off the city. And you can kind of see it here, and you know where the cities are off in the distance. And if there's low clouds, You can see it glowing off the clouds too. Yeah. But it picks up these fall equinox, summer and spring equinox, and just a simplistic thing. Most people know this, but spring is the point. Now, winter is the farthest that the sun is away from the northern hemisphere. So this is why we have Christmas and the death of winter. And it falls down 1 degree per day. The Sumerians had this down, and it stops right about this constellation called the Southern Cross. And due to our pivot, it seems to just die or sit there for 3 days and then start rising back up. And as it rises back up, we still have short days, right? You have the longest day of the year, which we're experiencing now, and the opposite of this is going to be the shortest day of the year. What's the in-between points? Well, that's fall, and that's spring, autumn and spring, cutting across the other direction of the zodiac. And during that time, the sun, which was very little of time compared to the nighttime, and slowly becomes more and more day and less night at that springtime, that Jesus moment that you know of. The amount of sunlight during the day takes over the amount of light. Yes, the light bringer. And then it goes all the way through the summer to today. Well, this will probably not go out today. It'll probably be a day or two late. I'll try to go ahead and throw it out. Hope I don't have to edit and do all that. Anyhow, Europe alone holds some 35,000 megaliths, including many astronomical aligned stone circles, as well as tombs or cromlechs. Crom, like in Conan the Barbarian. Crom. And other standing stones. These structures were mostly built between 6,500 and 4,500 years ago, largely around the Atlantic and Mediterranean coasts. That's because they were already seafarers. And we've seen recently, try to keep your posture good, people. We've seen recently where they found a boat dock, but I keep waiting for more information, or at least maybe a layout on the way it looks and the extent of it. But there's this huge wharf type fish dock that they found that's just, 15 to 30 foot below the water all the way, that was above water during the last ice age. And so it was built at a time when that was above water, some 8,000 years ago now, and that have a boat building place into it and everything in place that they realize is probably to warp wood, because you would put it in between and bend it back on these other ones, keep wetting it, then let it dry. And why are you warping wood? To build a boat. Well, people are told that 3500 BC is about the extent of Sumerian reed boats and Egypt. And yet we find that's not true. And in fact, in front of the Great Pyramid, they found a boat, and it was not held together with any nails whatsoever, and it's carved to the point that every little board fits together so well, not too much bitumen had to be used to hold it, and a bunch of ropes just keep it tight together. And something like that could be usable and even seaworthy. The most famous of these circles that we talk about, though, are Stonehenge, a monument in England that's thought to be around 5,000 years old. Though it's still old at that age, Stonehenge may be one of the youngest such sites or stone structures to be built in Europe. And so it's a belief that there may be a lot of more. Who knows what we don't know. But the chronology and extreme similarities between these widespread European sites lead some researchers to think the regional tradition of constructing megaliths first emerged along the coast of France. It was then passed across the region, eventually reaching Great Britain. But during the last ice age, Great Britain, Scotland and stuff was actually under a shelf of ice. And so all these people would have been down a lot more Mediterranean, which means Middle Earth, all around the Mediterranean and so on. And we can find these same sunwheel structures all through the Proto-Indo-Europeans, and we've talked about them. But the giant circle that, hell, I did months ago and finally released, and other sites that are built on this same concept. Arkham, and the fact that Arkham and that wood hinge that I showed, that I forget the name of right now, man, that they're on that and Stonehenge, they're on the exact same parallel from each other, and they're lined up to similar stars and everything, and it seems to be like, yeah, that's the same people. There's a lot more going on. Talk about the spice trade that started and all this stuff, and it's like, man, this way predates that, bud. These people had a lot more going on. It wasn't secluded little pockets of crap like people have tried to say and believe. But even these primitive sites are at least centuries younger than the world's oldest known stone circle at Nabta Playa. Located in Africa, Nabta Playa stands some 700 miles south of the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt. It was built more than 7,000 years ago by blue-eyed Caucasians, making Nabta Playa the oldest stone circle in the world. Not true. Göbekli Tepe is a stone circle, and it's astrologically lined up. In fact, there's like 50 of them. And made a whole lot better than this, and double its age. But we're going on this because the solstice day and everything, and they're trying to pimp this. This is the thing. And of course, whenever they say African, they're not saying Negroids whatsoever. Like Egypt was always blue-eyed Caucasians from the pre-dynastic and gibble-eyed mummies and everything. And if you'd like, I'll show that to you at the end of the video. Located in Africa, Nabta Playa stands some 700 miles south of the Great Pyramid, though, and it's possibly the Earth's oldest astronomical observatory. No, I think that we've gotten some things that are doing that are around Catalhoyuk and things, and then Göbekli Tepe and its related sites. And so I guess possibly would be a way of saying it, because this hasn't actually been dated correctly necessarily. They think they have it. They dug pretty good in a spot or two and pulled up some organic matter and got dates on it. It was constructed by a cattle worshipping cult of nomadic people to mark the summer solstice and the arrival of those monsoons that brought the fertile valley and bloomed right there. Whenever it slowly in front of their eyes, you can imagine, where there were pockets that would get rain, and so there were sustained trees, but at one time there would have been a lot of them, and then slowly but surely started to be not a lot of them. And if you'll look, they pretty much chopped down all the trees. And that probably caused more of a problem too, but they did it in a time that it was striving out. And from the earliest of times in the Egyptian dynasties, you can find them wanting to go to Lebanon and get the great cedars. And they talk about that in the Sumerians too, and the lords of Arata, and those people that live up at that top area of the Fertile Crescent. But nomadic cattle worshipping people, no, well, they may have been semi-nomadic or pseudo-nomadic. And you wonder what that is. And how about people during this time in the rainy season would live around here, and as it dried up and went away, they would go someplace else, i.e. the Nile, and then come back and hunt in between all the time. But whenever these puddles and swampish areas and things show up, a lot of animals show up with it, and so they're able to sustain themselves. And you think they're only doing farming and only got cows, but even Ma and Pa are hunter-gatherers. Little House on the Prairie and all that type of stuff. Fox hunting, just what the hell. All of that. Bird hunting. People eat that. You go fishing. People eat that. Was that hunting-gathering? I'll be damned. Have you ever went out and collected wild strawberries? Have you ever went out on your granddad's property right during the fall and picked up a couple of buckets worth of pecans that you turn around and shell and make pecan pie out of? That's gathering. When you go deer hunting, that's hunting. And if you use the deer, that really serves the same purpose as it did for people tens of thousands of years ago. It's weird to think of it on those levels sometimes. Here is human beings' first attempt to make some serious connection up with the heavens. J. McKim Malville, a professor emeritus at the University of Colorado and archaeoastronomy expert, tells Astronomy Magazine. This is, oh, by the way, this is in Astronomy Magazine. This was the dawn of observed astronomy, he adds. What in the world did they think about? Did they imagine these stars were gods? And what connections did they have with the stars and the stones? And I'll tell you now that the stars at this point are the gods, and the wandering stars, which is what planets mean, were worshipped as gods. Constellations were people like the Pleiades, were the seven sisters, and all these things. Even the angels that you hear about in your Bible are key pointed off of stars, certain stars. And so a lot of this comes from before, and everybody's wondering, if it's the chicken or the egg, which one comes first. And he's trying to tell you, well, here's the egg, right? Right here's the egg. But hold on. Didn't he tell you these people came in, were already cattle worshiping and stuff? He also said that they came in. And we know that those cattle, Botaurus, the cattle that we use today, is a derived form from off of that. And those come off of those people up in Catalhoyuk. Cattle. What? Catalhoyuk. Sumerian grains and stuff that were all done and changed long before then. In fact, we're going to talk about one grain that's in this area they found a little bit later and show you that also. In the 1960s, Egypt was planning a major dam along the Nile River, and it was going to flood important archaeological sites. We've talked about a few of these in the temple at Abu Simbel and things, and if you look at the picture here on the right, what they're basically doing is chopping up in pieces the actual statue and using these huge oversized cranes to move all these pieces into higher ground, because where they're at is going to end up being in the lake, and they didn't want to lose it, so they moved all the statues on. It's funny that they have to use this type of equipment to move it there, but these people got it there in the first place with the most simplistic of things, we're led to believe, right? United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, stepped in with funding to help relocate the famous structures, as well as scour the area for new sites before they were lost forever or trapped up underwater. But a prominent American archaeologist named Fred Windorf saw another opportunity. He wanted to search for the ancient origins of pharaonic Egypt away from the Nile River. Like, whenever it was green before, did anybody live right out there? While everyone was looking at temples, Windorf decided he would look at the desert. Says Malville, he opened up the era of pre-dynastic Egypt and the ancient kingdom by finding where the people used to live off the Nile a little bit, but in an area that had a part that would flood in part of the year and then dwindle down to a smaller thing and then flood in. Yeah. While everyone was looking for these temples, though, he took a right, the road less traveled. And man, all it would have taken is if he had some little airlight flying plane to zip out over there and all of a sudden go, what is that circle? But by luck, in 1973, a Bedouin, or a nomadic Arab, guide and smuggler named Eid Marif came across a group of what he thought looked like large stone megaliths while crossing the Sahara. Marif took Windorf, who he had worked with since the 1960s, out to this site, which sits some 60 miles away from the Nile. At first, Windorf thought they were natural formations, but he soon realized that the site was once a large lake bed that would have destroyed any such rocks in ancient times when the Sahara was green. He returned many times over the course of decades. Then, during excavations in the early 1990s, Windorf and a team of excavators, including Polish archaeologist Ramald Schild, uncovered a circle of stones that seemed to be aligned with the stars in some mysterious way. And this becomes it. So we're looking at this picture here, and Nabta Playa is way down here near Abu Simbel and 60 miles off of it. I never liked this map. I've seen it recreated a bunch of times. It does show the escarpment and the drop off in this area and the way that it cuts in kind of correctly. But looking at it right through here, it looks like the Nile is running on the top of mountains almost, as opposed to them being going down right there around it from both sides. Mentally, to me, it's the way they shaded it, because they're shading it the same way as they do the other side. Well, that's a go down. Okay, well then they should do that here on both sides, but instead it looks like a mountain. But so here's the Fayum and old Lake Moeris and stuff, the Delta. But this is way up here and after the first cataracts and things in early pre-dynastic Egypt. And they talk about, well, they had come from here, and these people in this land of Punt and all these things that some people still lived in. And yeah, all the way through the Horn of Africa at that time, there was Caucasians there. After 70 years without being able to crack their mystery, Windorf called in Malville, who's an expert in archaeoastronomy of the American Southwest. So he's familiar with looking at their symbology they had. Now, they had certain things to tell them when the seasons were coming, and it wasn't very extensive because most of them aren't doing farming in any way, but a lot of them would still tell them, well, here comes spring, and therefore the buffalo are going to go that way, let's get going. And that made them extremely successful with what they were doing once they figured out the patterns and the patterns in the sky and how they line up. Malvo says he too was puzzled when he first looked at maps of the ancient site. He knew he had traveled there in person to get a sense of the place, as well as its creators and celestial significance. They drove across the flat, sandy landscape until they reached a large sand dune beside a dry lake bed where views stretched out to the horizon. There they pitched their tents and set up camp, and while Malville sat in the sand beside the stones, he says he experienced an epiphany. It's kind of that eureka moment. I discovered that these stones were part of an alignment that radiated out from a major tumulus, a burial mound. A pile of these megaliths formed the covering of a tomb. And it turned out that every one of the megaliths that we found buried in sediment formed a line, like spokes in a wheel, radiating out. Now, the team had already performed radiocarbon dating on the site by taking samples from 5 hearth areas. Fire hearth areas and tamarisk roofing material found inside of the stone circle. It was likely a Zen experience, or like a Zen experience, to see how this fit together, he says. Knowing the dates, I could calculate when these stones would have been in alignment with the brightest stars of the northern sky. And so he was trying to get the idea, but the sun went down, and all of a sudden he's there and he's like, oh wow. And he does this for a living, but he had that epiphany. He discovered that the stone circle once aligned to Arcturus, Sirius, and Alpha Centauri. There were also stones that seemed to correspond to the constellation Orion, the hunter. And even in the earliest depictions we have of what we know of as Dynasty Zero, leading into dynastic Egypt, you see somebody standing in the pose of Orion the hunter, smiting someone on the head. I watched a video last night where they're really questioning on not necessarily just whether if Narmer or that even existed or whatever, or if there was even a battle between the North and South and then they got it together. Was there ever really a large Civil War thing that went on, like maybe what went on in America? But they're questioning whether it went on to that extent, if at all. That it was said to by, of course, a warring people and all this stuff, and you talk cocky and big and put it all together, but it's possible. Onward. By tracing back Arcturus' movement across the night sky, they proposed that the star would have been matched up with Nabta Playa's stone circle around 4800 BC. So it's 6800 BC in age or whatever. That makes it the oldest astronomical site that we've discovered. And that's Malville saying that, but I don't, maybe he's talking about him himself or these two guys that are there for, by this time, Göbekli Tepe's been found, and they realize it has that astronomical significance. Not to take anything away from this, or Stonehenge, which people quite often peck at. Their analysis was published in their Journal of Nature in 1998, drawing global headlines about the Stonehenge of the Sahara. In the decades since then, archaeologists have continued to unravel the mystery of the ancient people of Nabta Playa, who used their summer home to observe the stars. And so we talked a minute ago about how they were semi-nomadic, and they would have lived here through the summer part of it, and during the winter time gone elsewhere and back. Yeah, people still do this somewhat, but it's a total different world than that, isn't it now? Where are we at? 37? Let's continue. This cattle cut they're talking about, more than 10,000 years ago, northern Africa shifted away from cold, dry ice climate that had persisted for tens of thousands of years. With the shift, African monsoons migrated north relatively quickly, filling up seasonal lakes, or playa, that provided short-lived oases for life. And so the Sahara became green again. So I talked about how the Sahara before the Sahara was green, but before that it was starved out too. Bad, if not worse. And it has gone in shifts. And how long's that been going on? Well, there's this sandstone that they have out there that's in layers, much like the desert Southwest, that says millions of years. Yeah, it outdates humans. Over here on the right's a reconstruction of that calendar, and you can see how I talked about how it's kind of perfect around this side here, and it gets here and it's squished off. But if you go from here all the way around, that circle, and this is just kind of ruined right in there. Then there's the other alignments that are around in it too. And not only the two lines that we're seeing right there, but there's a few other stones that are there too, and outside the circle that point towards other things that might just be kind of a spring solstice, so they can go, okay, we're getting to that point, so now we start watching for this, and now we watch that. It's kind of important though. Farmers still use almanacs. I might have to do a video and sometime and explain the old Farmer's Almanac hooked up with Ben Franklin. People know about that. Harper's Almanac and things. But almanac goes back a long way. In fact, at one time it was sacred knowledge. And when to plant things and all this stuff. And these people had figured it out long, long ago. Nomadic people who lived in the area These summer rains were likely sacred. During this era before agriculture had spread across the globe, these nomads survived primarily off of wild resources. But somewhere around the same time in the same region, people began domesticating goats, as well as an ancient kind of cattle called aurochs. And cattle did not come from Africa. These cattle came from northern areas in the Middle East and up through Anatolia, and it's those people who came down and brought the cattle with them in a time long, long before the start of Egypt. And you want to say, well, what cattle worship cult, what are you talking about? Well, the very first thing in a video I've just done recently showed in it the Narmer palette. And in the Narmer palette, not only is make it look like an arrowhead that's real giant, but on that Narmer palette there, it's got Hathor. And Hathor is that cow goddess. It's primordial, one of their first, if you will, part of their main theogony. So cattle were a central part of Nabta Playa's culture. When Windorf's team excavated the site's central tomb, they hoped to find human remains. Instead, they dug up a cattle bones and an enormous rock seemingly carved into the shape of a cow, and they also found one in the shape of a falcon. The people of Nabta Playa would travel across the often featureless Sahara from seasonal lake to seasonal lake, bringing their livestock along to graze and drink. And the first time I did this video, I got to right here, and this piece that I was showing you is this man on this video where he's recreating him going there and finding that statue. And in the video it shows a couple of pictures, and it just shows him going across the desert 60 miles basically in the middle of nowhere, and they flagged it. And so I took it out, and then they flagged the other part, and so I'm not doing it. And I'm real tired of this. I can't even put 15 seconds of video in of some video from 20 years ago. But so the people of Nabta Playa would travel across the often featureless Sahara desert from seasonal lake to seasonal lake, bringing and driving their livestock along to graze and drink. Yeah, and these Caucasians didn't have horses at that time. It would have really helped out, and it did later, eventually, but you can do it without, for especially if the cattle are already domesticated. They hang around. They know that you're protecting them, regardless of whether you take one out every once in a while and hey. Their experience was rather similar to Polynesian navigators who had to sail from one place to another, Malville says he suspects. They used the stars to travel across the desert to locate small watering holes like Nabta Playa, which had water about 4 months of the year, probably starting with those summer monsoons, leading up into a time of winter and going away. And as I said, that's a different time of a year, definitely, than you would think for going in, because it would have said that they have a late season there. And that really helped out people around the area and people up in Anatolia and things whenever they had droughts and they didn't have much and they ran short, because as they started to run short, Egypt was kicking. And it didn't run off the same rain and so on that the other people did. Hand in hand, it worked great. There was no North Star at the time, and so the people navigated using bright stars and the circular motion of the heavens. Windorf himself had a powerful experience that cemented his belief in this idea. One day, while working at Nabta Playa, the team had lost track of time and had to drive back across the sand at night. Marif, the Bedouin man who initially discovered Nabta Playa, took the wheel, navigating across the Sahara by sticking his head out of the window to use the stars as his guide. Yeah, this is going to go on to part 2 right now, guys, and it's in your top left-hand corner. Part 2